Ellis Island. The U.S. government opened an immigration station in 1892 on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Over the next 62 years, some 112 million immigrants would pass through Ellis Island on their way to begin a new life. Immigrants had to pass inspection before being allowed to enter the United States. For those who traveled in first or second class, inspectors came aboard ship to check their health and review their papers. Those who traveled in steerage had to make their way through the immigration checkpoint at Ellis Island. The inspection process usually took up to 5 hours. Immigrants waited nervously, fearful they would be sent back home. Doctors would scan each passenger for signs of serious disease or disability. Immigrants who did not pass the medical inspection were sent back, some penniless and without their families. In peak years, as many as 20% of immigrants were held for weeks or longer at Ellis Island before being allowed to land. Sick passengers stayed at the island's hospital until they recovered. Those whose papers did not pass review were held for a hearing. About 5 out of every 6 passengers who were detained were eventually cleared to enter. After passing inspection, immigrants were free to enter the United States and begin their new lives. Some headed off on their own, while others met family members already in the United States. One Russian Jewish immigrant remembered meeting her father for the first time in 1910. History's Voices. I saw a man coming forward, and he was so beautiful I didn't know he was my father. Later on, I realized why he looked so familiar to me. He looked exactly like I did. But that's when I met him for the first time, and I fell in love with him, and he with me. Catherine Baychok, Ellis Island History. Angel Island. After 1910, newcomers arriving on the West Coast were processed at Angel Island, an immigration station in San Francisco Bay. Some immigrants passed through Angel Island fairly quickly, but many Chinese immigrants were detained for weeks or months while awaiting a ruling on whether or not they could stay. The people detained at Angel Island faced prison-like conditions. Much of the time they were locked in barracks to prevent escape and were allowed outside only for supervised recreation. To relieve the boredom of life at Angel Island, some Chinese immigrants wrote poetry on the walls of their barracks. Their poems often expressed resentment and despair over their treatment. History's Voices. Imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, my freedom withheld. How can I bear to talk about it? I look to see who is happy, but they only sit quietly. I am anxious and depressed and cannot fall asleep. After experiencing such loneliness and sorrow, why not just return home and learn to plow the fields? Anonymous Chinese Immigrant. For those immigrants who were finally allowed to settle in the United States, a stressful ordeal was over. Yet for many, the hard times were just beginning. Poverty and discrimination faced many new arrivals. Building urban communities. Many immigrants found themselves better off in the United States than they had been. Still, they typically experienced hardships. Most immigrants settled in crowded cities. Most could find only low-paying, unskilled jobs. As a result, new immigrants generally had no choice but to live in poor housing in teeming slums, frequently near the factories where they worked. In the cities of the Northeast and Midwest, immigrants usually settled near others from their homeland, or even their home city or province. Surrounded by people who spoke their language and shared their culture, newcomers found companionship and got help adapting to their new lives. Meanwhile, the cities became a patchwork of ethnic clusters. In these immigrant neighborhoods, residents built institutions to keep their cultures alive. They established churches and synagogues so they could practice their religious faith. Many religious organizations provided their members with economic assistance, training courses, and child care. In a number of cities, residents formed benevolent societies, aid organizations to help immigrants. Some benevolent societies helped immigrants obtain jobs, health care, or education. Some collected a few cents from members every month. In return, members received financial support if they became too ill to work and they were buried when they died. These benevolent societies made a huge difference in helping immigrants through difficult times. At the time, there were no state-sponsored programs to help poor and needy people. The benevolent societies filled this void. At the same time, they helped build a sense of community among immigrants.